evening, everyone. I'm Chris Stover from the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, CCEPA, on behalf of our Executive Director, Dr. Sheila Brown, and our Chair, Bill Black, and our founding institutions, the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you this evening for our just-in-time debate, where we ask the question, can we be good without God? Before we get to that, a couple of housekeeping matters. There's some forms in front of you, some evaluation forms. We'd be very grateful if you could fill those out, put your thoughts down. Your feedback is very important to us. The second thing I'd like to make mention of, it's also on the information table at the back. In this auditorium on March the 11th, part 2 of our 4-part series, Trust in Education, will go forward. It features Sir John Daniel, who's head of the Commonwealth of Learning, and it's, as I say, part 2 of a 4-part series on trust in education, so make time for that if you can. I'm very excited about tonight's debate, which is a culmination of conversations that have taken place at CCEPA over the past couple of years. And I think we need to get right to it. So I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening's event. He's a friend of CCEPA and Halifax lawyer. He's Kevin Kindred.
I have to time myself as much as I have to time them. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, CCEPA. I'm pleased to serve as moderator tonight, and I'm pleased to have some limited involvement in the work that CCEPA does. I've always been quite appreciative of the work that they do to bring us together in fora like this to discuss important issues of public policy and public affairs. And particularly this Just-in-Time series, 2 of which I've participated in now, which really are speaking to current events type issues that I don't want to say are ripped from the headlines, but certainly are on the pulse of discussions that are going on in broader society, trying to present them to you in a good formal academic way, but also in a very engaging way that the public can have access to. This particular debate, as Chris said, has been something that's been discussed at CCEPA for some time, but I think the spark really to hold this debate came when there was an application by a group called Humanist Canada to run an ad on a bus, and the ad said, "You can be good without God." And a lot of controversy came from that, and a lot of attention and a lot of debate. And I think there was some talk at CCEPA that maybe this is the right time to bring to fruition this idea that they've had for a while about having a debate on just this topic. Can you be good without God? Is religion somehow fundamental to our ability to distinguish right from wrong in society? But obviously this question is not something that CCEPA invented, and the journey didn't start on a bus or off a bus, as the case may be. As long as there have been people who believe in God, there have been people who question the belief in God. 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, the author of Psalm 14 told us that the fool has said in his heart that there is no God. The source, it should be noted, is somewhat less than impartial. And as long as there's been doubt about religion and about the existence of God, there's also been a keen sense of the relationship between religious belief and morality. Psalm 14 goes on to tell us a little bit about the fools who say that there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none that doeth good. They are all gone aside. They are altogether become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Well, a lot has changed since 1000 BC, and I think most of us will say, thank God. Well, perhaps not exactly in those terms. But there have been times and places in history where simply not believing in God has been ground for punishment and even death. Even short of those extremes, I think it's fair to say that for a lot of our history, the connection between religion and morality was so strong as to be unquestionable. Only philosophers could have even made sense of the question, can we be good without God? For the average person, being good and being holy were likely synonymous, and the question would be unfathomable. Today, though, and in the Western world anyway, we take secularism seriously. Even the most passionately religious among us recognize the right of others to believe differently or not at all. And we all recognize some concept of a separation of church and state, whatever that means to us in our circumstances. And so we now live in a society where, to some, religion is at best an adjunct to our daily lives, if it has any role at all. And nonetheless, religion continues to be all around us, and not just the outward trappings of religion, the churches and synagogues, the crosses and crescents, but the fundamental values that we derive from or associate with religion continue to be fundamental to our culture. And so the question, can we be good without God, has gone from being unfathomable to being fundamental to understanding the way that the world works. So how do we ask ourselves this question? Maybe the hardest part of planning any debate is setting the right question and framing up the issues properly. So when Chris Stover and I first started working on the preparation for this, we spent a lot of time asking ourselves just that. How do we ask this question? And we had input from the participants as well. And we've also had, through the magic of email and Facebook, some of your input on the question as well. I say the magic of email and Facebook. I have to convince Chris sometimes that email is not magic. It's actually part of our everyday lives now. But so while I like the question as we've said it, can you be good without God? I think it's also fair to highlight some of the problems in that question. Some might say that the question is skewed. Why don't we ask instead, can you be good with God? Fair question. Others have asked whether the question maybe is too simple. What do you mean by God? What do you mean by good? I'm reminded of a former U.S. president who avoided a tricky question by saying it depends on what your definition of is. But it's worthwhile to think about defining our terms, and our speakers may have some thoughts about exactly how we've defined our terms in setting the question. And some might debate whether you can really address a question like this at all in a debate. And to that I say, I'm glad that I'm the moderator and not a participant, but I'm sure if anyone can turn this into a fruitful discussion, it's the two gentlemen beside me that I'm about to present to you. So speaking first will be Eric Beresford. Eric's the president of the Atlantic School of Theology, a position he's held since December 2004. He's a scholar and prolific writer who's widely published in professional journals and sought after as a consultant and speaker at workshops and conferences in the fields of ethics, environmental justice, conflict and change, and human sexuality. Ken Beresford is an ordained Anglican priest who has served parishes in England and Canada and continues to serve on national committees of the Anglican Church of Canada. And after Eric speaks, we'll hear from Justin Trottier. Justin is the executive director of the Centre for Inquiry Canada, which describes itself as Canada's premier venue for humanists, skeptics, and free thinkers. He's also president of the Free Thought Association of Canada, a nonprofit organization promoting education and outreach and the principles of various secular worldviews. He's a frequent voice in the media for secularism, including the Globe and Mail's regular panel on religion and society, and has been active on political issues, including freedom of speech, the introduction of religious arbitration in Ontario, and the separate schools question. So that's how we're going to ask the question and who's going to help us answer it. I want to say a note about the format as well. We'll have time for short opening statements by the panelists, 15 to 20 minutes or so, and also an opportunity for them to rebut. And then we'll move, hopefully quickly, from that into a question period. I'm going to try to start off the question period by directing some questions to the debaters myself, and from that we'll move into questions from the audience. When it gets to questions from you, and this debate really is here for you, to help you as much as us answer the question. But I do have to say a couple of words about questions from the audience. This is a topic that I think a lot of people feel deeply, passionately, and emotional about. So with that in mind, it's important to remember the importance of keeping the tone of our comments or questions respectful. And if you find yourself unable to do so, my job is to find a way of making you do so. Also, I think we have to respect the time that we've allotted to the event, and this is a topic that I think all of us could probably make lengthy comments about, but we would like to give the debaters a full opportunity to respond to the points that you're making. So it should be possible to make whatever point you need to make within 30 seconds to a minute. If you find that a struggle, then again, my job is to help you find a way to keep your comments to about 30 seconds to a minute. I also have to encourage you, or really direct you with no option, to, if you're making comments, to go to the microphone that you see set partway up the stairs. That's important not just for amplification purposes, but because the evening is being recorded. And if you are making comments from your seats, unfortunately, it's going to make for a very boring DVD presentation afterwards. So I really will be taking comments from the people who line up orderly at the microphone. So having set it up that way, I don't think you need to hear any further from me. I'll turn it over to Eric, who will start off the debate.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I want to begin by thanking CCEPA for organizing this evening's event, and also thank Justin and the Free Thought Association of Canada for stimulating this discussion. I think I also owe a thanks to the Atheist Society at Dalhousie, too, who I see here this evening, who've been part of setting this up. As I begin, I find myself at something of a disadvantage in a number of ways. You may remember that the initial slogan that was placed on the buses in London was, "There probably is no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." I'll want to say something about the moral perspective assumed in that slogan later, but for now, let me acknowledge that today is Ash Wednesday, a day when Christians are not particularly given to enjoying themselves. So it might seem to be a day when we're easy targets for that particular slogan. So tough on me. In addition, the slogan changed. The slogan that was planned for Halifax was, "You can be good without God." And that shaped the title of our panel for this evening. So here's my second problem, because I clearly agree that you can be good without God. Indeed, I would also agree with its opposite, that believers can behave in ways that are far from good and justify their actions on the basis of their beliefs. This is not news, and I'm sure that if he chose to, Justin could give you many examples of the behavior of religious people that I would find embarrassing. But then, this is an insight that goes all the way back through the Judean Christian perspective into our very scriptures. Taken as a whole, one of the most important overarching themes of those scriptures is that human beings are capable of both goodness and malice, and that religious people are no different in this than anybody else. The message of those texts is not the goodness of religious believers, but rather the faithfulness of God to those who are called and yet who are too often unfaithful. It's God's goodness that is expressed, not the goodness of religious believers. Religious believers do not have a monopoly on goodness, nor do they have a monopoly on ethical insight. If they did, you might expect religious believers to agree with each other about what is good and what isn't. They don't. I'm an Anglican, part of a tradition that has taken to washing its dirty linen in public over recent years in highly visible and often very acrimonious moral debates. I won't bore you with the details tonight, except to say that they make clear that being religious does not guarantee that you will have particular moral views. I can go further, because while religious people can rightly claim that their views have given shape to the moral assumptions of our wider culture, they clearly have, so much so indeed that those assumptions now seem self-evident and beyond question sometimes. Yet it is also true to say that the religions have been shaped by the cultures of which they're a part. Now, this shouldn't really surprise us. Religious communities are not hermetically sealed and never have been. Let me give an interesting example. Orthodox Christianity celebrates two interesting saints, Balaam and Jehoshaphat, who are supposed to have lived in India around the 4th, 5th century. What has become clear to scholars is that Jehoshaphat is in fact a corruption of the Georgian Idosaph, which is a transcription of the Arabic Yudashaf or Budashaf, which turns out to be derived from the Sanskrit bodhisattva. The saints in question turn out to be Gautama Buddha. And the story doesn't end there, because the story of Jehoshaphat was deeply influential on the far from orthodox Christian novelist Leo Tolstoy, whose writings on the Sermon on the Mount so profoundly shaped the thinking and practices of Mahatma Gandhi. So the story weaves between traditions, between continents and cultures, between sacred and secular. Now, if all this is true, why am I taking part in this debate? If religious commitments do not necessarily make people better, although there's some interesting recent sociological evidence to suggest that there is some effect, and if religious commitments do not add particular moral insights, why would religion be relevant? This question is particularly acute in a society like ours, which is pluralistic and intentionally multicultural. I want to suggest that the question as we often think about it has been misdirected, and that it got misdirected because of the ways in which conversations about ethics have been shaped in our culture, at least since the time of the Greeks, so before Christianity. While the question of how to live the good life is a universal question, I believe, in human societies, I want to suggest that ethics, at least as a form of discourse, the form of discourse we're familiar with, as a series of moral arguments that we are familiar with, is actually a product of cultural anxiety and uncertainty. The first ever book published with the title An Ethics was Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. It was published at a time when new peoples and new ideas were flooding into the center of the growing empire, into Athens. The cultural values that had been taken for granted were now brought into question as they appeared alongside other values. And who was to say that Athenian values were superior, say, to Spartan values? And what happens to Athenian values if we cannot claim that? It is in this context that Aristotle writes his Ethics and the companion book, The Politics, precisely to defend the Athenian values that seem to him to be under threat. We see another burst of ethical writing in the period we call the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, in fact, can be seen in itself as a response to the uncertainties created when the old authorities of European society were brought down in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. As a result of that cataclysm within European culture, the question became, how could we know what was true? Who can we trust? Descartes' answer famously is nobody and nothing. We use doubt, and we chase doubt down the road until we arrive at the place that can no longer be doubted. Cogito ergo sum. Of course, each of those terms could mean so many things, it perhaps can be doubted, but anyway, that's beside the point. And we build up from there. In the ethical area, both the utilitarians, Bentham and Mill, and Kant are seeking to ground ethics in nothing other than the activity of pure practical reason, as Kant calls it. Now, my point here is again the issue is doubt, uncertainty, and the need to secure the moral life. And I would suggest that the preoccupation with ethics in our own era bears the same imprint and is haunted by the same anxieties. Now, this is too brief a history, but it does allow me to point to some characteristics of ethics that are important. First is that it became cast in the form of argument and counter-argument. If the purpose of ethics was to secure the moral life, then the question that needed to be asked was, who's right, who's wrong? And perhaps also, and how do we know that? The difficulty is that these arguments have proved, in the words of the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, to be interminable. Not simply in the sense that they go on, but more importantly in the sense that they can find no terminus, no common ground from which they can start to converge. This focus on reason, or a particular style of reason, has also led to a number of problems, and I want to quickly identify two before turning to what religious traditions might have to offer in this context. The first problem is that the understanding of reason that emerged in the Enlightenment was one that was to be detached, disembodied, disinterested. True statements are to be true independently of who speaks them and from what context they're spoken. However, I would say there's no view from nowhere. And while this approach may well be productive in the area of science, in the field of ethics, being conscious of the context from which we speak is crucially important. The bus slogan that began this debate will help me to illustrate this. There probably is no God. Now relax and enjoy your life. Now, I don't read this slogan as necessarily hedonistic, as some critics have done. However, in a global context, I do believe that the slogan reflects a context of privilege, where such relaxation and enjoyment is possible. I find myself wondering what that bus slogan meant as it drove down the A30 through the deeply impoverished communities of Brixton, or what it might mean in the slums of Mumbai, or in Oshawa, where unemployment continues to rise in response to the convulsions in our economy and in the motor industry. A second problem that I see has to do with the assumption implicit in the work of major moral theorists who provide the conceptual framework for modernity that persuasive moral argument would help to make people good. Now, if that were true, then ethicists would be more moral than the general population. And I have empirical evidence to the contrary. It's interesting to note that in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, the three areas that suffer the greatest problem with theft are law, theology, might as well own it for myself, and ethics. Finally, this takes me to what I want to say about religion. Of course, religionists have been involved in the types of ethical discourse that I've been talking about, as has anybody. But there is another approach to the moral life within religion that is quite characteristic and which brings something different to the table. Let me speak from my own tradition only because I know it best, and I don't like speaking on behalf of others. When Christian thinkers began to think for the first time systematically and in a focused way about the moral life, which actually was only about the 4th century, they did not begin with moral theory or moral justification. They began with their identity and their experience of community because they understood themselves to be a people whose identity was defined in their relationship to God and their relationship to each other. Christian theology therefore took a quite different route from moralism pure and simple. The focus that emerges is not on who's right and who's wrong and how we know that, but rather on a set of communal practices that begin in this sense of interrelatedness that is at the heart of theology and which illuminates the moral life, shapes moral pedagogy, and establishes ways of dealing with moral failure. It is these religiously rooted practice that brings something new to the table. The first task, then, it turns out, when we look at these early moral theorists, or moralists, moral theologians, is to learn how to tell truthfully the story of my own particular moral life and its failures, to tell it simply, clearly, without self-justification or dissimulation. The interesting fact here is that moral reflection starts out then not as being normative but as descriptive. The normative will follow, but we start in the descriptive. And immediately we are thrown into a recognition of the importance of articulating the space we occupy, where we're coming from when we make moral claims, whether for ourselves or for others. We're reminded of the importance of interpretation. Too often in ethical debates, people talk past each other rather than to each other because they're quite simply talking about different things. The first distinction, then, I want to make between moral theology and ethics is that moral theology is not theory-driven. It's driven by attentiveness and by the practices that sustain that. Secondly, the moral theologies that emerged in the 4th century were not satisfied to delineate the good in abstraction from actual lives lived. The purpose of ethical theory is to show us what the good life might look like and to allow us to describe and defend an account of the good life. But truthfully, most of our lives are not wholly good. It's therefore not enough to distinguish between actions that are right and good and actions that are wicked and unacceptable, because that leaves us without any resources for dealing with the reality that our lives, both as individuals and as communities, will always contain a mixture of both. If we acknowledge this and acknowledge that moral arguments will not in and of themselves make us morally good, then we're drawn face to face with the question of moral pedagogy. How are we shaped morally? My point is that secular ethics has largely failed to pay attention to this question because it's assumed that the way it's done is through moral argument. And I've already said that there's evidence to suggest that that's not helpful. I would suggest that real moral lives are sufficiently textured and layered and complex that they cannot be adequately captured by mere rules and obligations. It requires imagination and attentiveness to the narrative shape of our lives. Finally, in addition to the question of education, there's also the need, by the way, one of the differences between the ancient moralists and, say, someone like Augustine was the ancient moralists believed if you showed someone the good, they would necessarily do it. And Augustine said, no, they won't. And I think some of the evidence has been that Augustine was actually right on that point. Finally, in addition to the question of education, there's also the need for moral renewal after failure. There's a need to foster practices of reconciliation that will help both individuals and communities to survive moral failure. The different practices of confession that emerged in the 4th century, and the ways that they did, were intended to be a means to restore moral community, an attempt to bring some measure of healing both to the person who had done wrong and to the community that had experienced fracture and brokenness as a result of moral failure. The issue of moral reconciliation is, I believe, crucial. And you can read the great moral philosophers until you're blue in the face. You will find insightful and helpful discussions about what is right and what is wrong, but you will find nothing on what we do when things have gone wrong. Perhaps the most compelling example of such a practice in the modern era is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, the brainchild of and presided over by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The commission began with the premise that there could be no reconciliation and therefore no future for South Africa without undertaking the dangerous but essential task of telling the truth of what we had done to each other, acknowledging its horror, and out of this learning not only who we have been, but who we must become if we're to reconstruct our relationships and our society into the future. The point is that rules and principles will tell us what we should do. They cannot reconstruct relationships from the fragments that are left after moral failure. That requires moral imagination, will, and courage, and attentiveness, again, to each other. It reflects a commitment to moral community that begins, I believe, in the recognition of our relationship to God as the one who loves despite our failings, who is the source of a unity and equality that transcends all merely empirical differences between human persons. Religious traditions, then, have practices that intentionally relate the good for individual lives to the communities of which they're a part. Practices that shape moral pedagogy, practices that offer contexts for reconciliation and healing. Now, perhaps these can be developed without recourse to such traditions, but that has to be yet to be attempted, let alone proved. Further, if it is to happen, then there will need to be a move from the narrowly rationalistic concerns and constraints that have shaped ethical discourse in our wider secular culture in the recent past, to embrace not only reason, but also the practices that make sense of and shape real and sustainable moral communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and now to Justin.
Not sure how close to get to this. One of my role models, philosopher and ethicist Paul Kurtz, often conducts the following experiment with his students during his first lecture, and I'll ask you to participate in this. It's a silent thought experiment. Kurtz will ask, referring to the biblical story in which God commands Abraham to show his faith by killing his only son Isaac, if the story could have turned out the other way. Could God have allowed Abraham to go ahead with the sacrifice? Pause for you to consider that. If you answer yes, as one person in all of Professor Kurtz's years of study answered, then are God's ethics worthy of us? And if you answered no, as just about everybody does, are you not proving your ability to judge what's right and wrong independent of divine command? This is a form of the Euthyphro argument made by Plato 2,500 years ago in his dialogue by the same name. Socrates asks, are things pious because the gods love them, or do the gods love them because they are pious? As you can see, both of these resolutions lead to a dilemma of sorts. I think C.S. Lewis, the famous Christian apologist, would agree. He said, quote, the ultimate question is whether the doctrine of the goodness of God or that of the inerrancy of Scripture is to prevail when they conflict. I think the doctrine of the goodness of God is the more certain of the two. Indeed, only that doctrine renders this worship of him obligatory or even permissible, end quote. Lewis here seems to be saying that understanding what is good, understanding right and wrong, must come before commitment to a faith tradition or community. I'm very glad to have been invited by the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs to this just-in-time debate. I want to thank Kevin and Eric. It's an honor to be participating alongside both of you. The Atheist Bus Campaign, which is, I guess, the motivation to have this, among others, as Eric mentioned, there's a lot of discussion about the supposed ethical bankruptcy inherent in the slogan itself. So it's nice that I have the opportunity to address the ethical underpinnings of humanism and certain philosophies of non-belief. And I will address some of Eric's remarks, but I will have to do so after I go through my prepared speech and in later portions of this evening. Before I get into that, I want to clear up one possible confusion. The adjective purely that describes the secular society that we're debating. A secular society, pure or unpure, is not an atheist society. It is one in which believers and non-believers are treated equally, and the government does not endorse either a religious or an atheistic worldview. So if we are debating the merits and goodness of a secular society, we're not assuming necessarily that everybody is an atheist. I think that should go without saying. The debate question, can we be good without God, does beg a question, and Kevin pointed that out. Are we to take it for granted that we can be good with God? Are there in actual fact any societies currently or throughout history driven by a theistic government we might defend as good, and which simultaneously were coherent enough to have lasted longer than a few centuries? For religiously based societies are clearly not free of their own problems, and I promise not to dwell on this point, but I do have to deal with it briefly, because it's important to understand that both religious and secular societies face challenges. Religious societies have clearly committed horrendous acts, and we don't have to go into that. What's more relevant to my point is the inconsistent way that the same book can be used to justify opposite ethical beliefs. Religious ethics are themselves situational and inconsistent. They show evolution and change within secular society. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books supposedly written by Moses, show evidence of many authors, and every significant historical event was stamped with divine approval. God's 10 commandments include no killing, but 12 chapters later, God commands, slay every man his brother. The Bible has been used on both sides of debates on homosexuality, the divine right of kings, divorce, slavery. I could go on and on. Biblical ethics are therefore quite situational. In fact, New Testament ethical views are grounded in the moral concerns of their own day. They are based on responses to situations confronting the embryonic church, as Paul and others dealt organically with specific moral issues that cropped up at the time. And today, Christ himself is used as something of an inkblot test. His ethics are claimed to be those of liberal theologians, capitalists, feminist theologians. The danger is that each side makes their view appear immune by calling on divine authority to back it up. Of course, none of this is to imply biblical ethics make no positive contributions. For one, they prove that situational ethics can work. They show how ethics evolve when a community is faced with new situations and when the old rules no longer apply and can no longer give community coherence. And the Bible, no doubt, has many useful things to say to us today. My point is simply that no one religious community has a monopoly on ethical insight, and that societies, especially pluralistic secular ones, cannot base their ethics on a single unchanging tradition. Societies that embrace their citizens' diversity do much better, I think. I'm glad that there's little debate today about the ethics of individual atheists. I want to submit, though, that there's plenty of secular pluralistic societies on this planet that are living proof of the affirmative answer to our debate questions concerning the building of good, community-focused secular societies. Unlike typical examples of atheistic communist countries where individuals are forced to atheism, countries that embrace secularism, a simple neutrality with respect to both belief and unbelief, can prosper greatly. In his book, Society Without God, Phil Zuckerman looks at the Danes and the Swedes, probably the most godless people on earth. They don't seem to be failing in terms of building a community. They have a top-notch welfare and healthcare service. They have a strong commitment to social equality. In a 2005 study looking at 18 democracies, it was found that the more atheistic a society, the more higher percentage of atheists, tended to have relatively low murder and suicide rates and relatively low incidence of abortion and teen pregnancy. Moving to some other regions of the planet, consider India. India's first Prime Minister, Nehru, who was educated in the West, wrote a constitution explicitly secular. The country clearly has ongoing problems, but compared to many of its neighbors, it is relatively peaceful and progressive. Consider Turkey, an officially secular country of majority Muslim citizens. Compared to other countries with majority Muslim citizens, it leads in areas like development, literacy, and crime. These examples show that secular societies can and do thrive. The citizens are no more likely to commit crime or to fail to engage in community life. What are your ethics, your values, your meaning, and your purpose? Whatever they may be to you, they can't just be adopted wholesale, without reflection or inquiry from an external, transcendental entity, because then they do not really belong to you, do they? They are God's ethics, values, meaning, and purpose. A believer, to be fulfilled and happy, must make a personal decision with their own conscience to choose the ethics of God or their community, to choose God as worthy of worship. And that is a secular decision. Accepting religious ethics can't be based on religion. That would be a circular argument. Non-believers, too, can make a personal, conscience-based decision regarding their ethics. That genuine conscience requires religion has it backwards. Genuine religion requires conscience. If one's practice of religion is to be authentic, it must be based on one's honest assessment of what makes sense. The secular conscience stands prior to and independent of all religions, and it alone can point to a shared vocabulary for public debate in a pluralistic society. Existentialist philosophy suggests that while there is no objective moral code on which to rely, we can't help but make ethical decisions as we go about our lives. Man is in that sense condemned to be free and defines human morality through personal decisions. Religious ethics doesn't get us out of this existential bind, for if God invents right and wrong from nothing, he is but a cosmic existentialist, defining his own purpose. And we humans can do likewise. We can, through intersubjective discussion, develop big goals and projects that fulfill us. Scientific discovery, exploration of our universe, creative and artistic contributions to community, environmental protection, these are all possibilities. The existential freedom to courageously invent together our individual and shared purpose can be exhilarating. The quest to develop ethics without God is both ancient and varied. Aristotle, whose physics dominated the Middle Ages, actually had little use for religious ethics, basing his morals on human nature rather than divine rewards and punishments. His was an ethic based on a commitment to personal excellence rather than duty and rights. Epicurus thought that one could seek pleasures through tranquility and limiting desires and fears, including fear of God and death. The centrality of pleasure, stated in the form of happiness, continues in consequentialist schools of secular political philosophy like utilitarianism and its emphasis on the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Very different are deontological philosophers like Kant, for whom specific actions could be identified as right or wrong without regard to consequences. His belief was that reason could find universal norms, at the top of which is the categorical imperative. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Kant believed in free choice constrained only by reason, but Kantian conscience is free in order that it may follow norms, and those are publicly available and can be discovered through public examination. Again, we have the emphasis on the public space of a secular society. John Rawls is probably the best-known 20th century secular political philosopher. His theory of justice as fairness used a thought experiment in which individuals were to build a society that would maximize the well-being of all concerned, but in which a veil of ignorance, as he put it, was placed. No one knew which position they were to occupy in that society. The concept of an inherent right, human right to fairness, as found in Rawls and most systems of secular ethics, is not to be found in biblical ethics. The concept of inherent human rights is replaced in the Bible with rights which are bestowed or acquired through God, often only on people by virtue of membership in a select community. The UN Universal Human Rights Declaration, the most progressive document ever written by the planet as a whole, I would hope, is an individualistic, not group-focused document, and it contains no mention of God for its justification. It might be compared, as one example, to the Islamic Human Rights Declaration, as drafted by the Organization for the Islamic Conference. This declaration loses the concept of individualism by focusing on the protection of the community of believers and sometimes of the Islamic religion itself. It insists, for example, on censorship and the closing down of the open society when defamation of religion might result. An ethical system should be judged on how it treats its most vulnerable people. A tribal ethic that has no way of coming at itself from above, and here I'm not only referring to any one religion, and critiquing its own system through confrontations with distinct value systems is hence problematic for those individuals that do not accept this ethic of the tribe from within their own traditional framework. Put simply, the open secular society is the single best way we have for people of divergent beliefs and religions to live together. Precisely by not being based on rigid and perfectly coherent systems of ethics, secular society allows for moral development. Development often takes place when old morality is challenged or begins to break down so that ethical inquiry can begin. You need some friction with a pluralist, and a pluralistic democracy can provide that sense of friction. At the same time, not everything goes. Secular society can use principles of critical inquiry from outside to judge all ethical systems, religious and non-religious, equally. I've used the term open society quite a bit, so let me define what I mean by it. I'm using a concept developed by philosopher Austin Dacey in a recent book called The Secular Conscience that I recommend greatly. He compares the open conscience to the free press. The press is protected from autocratic rule so that it can pursue its own course autonomously, but that doesn't mean the press is private. Rather, it's autonomous so that it can perform a vital job within the public square. Similarly, each person's conscience is protected from coercion in order that it may pursue, in dialogue with others, such as here tonight, its vital questions of meaning, identity, value, and truth. Through the open society, we can come to better understand these questions. The brilliance of a secular society, as envisioned by John Stuart Mill, John Locke, James Madison, and others, was that by moving belief and ethics from the governmental arena of law and coercion into the public square, it becomes something for conscience and conversation. In the public square, citizens carry on debate in newspaper editorials, in letters to the editor, in blogs, in houses of worship, in governmental forums, even in pubs. Mill liked the idea because it favored experimental ethics and experiments in living in which people could then share the results with each other. It also promised that ethics could be fallible. In that sense, John Dewey drew the connection between democracy and scientific inquiry. Democracy being a way of life involving inquisitiveness, openness to experience, deliberation across differences, and yes, fallibility. I think the same is true of ethical development. How much time do I have?
I was just about to hand you the 5 minutes.
The 5 minutes? Okay. So I'll make one last foray into another topic. Since I have a bit of extra time, I want to venture beyond philosophy for a moment and discuss something that's a bit on the edge of science, evolutionary ethics. Although it's certainly true that fact can't lead to values, that an is does not necessarily imply an ought, yet right, and human right, does imply can. That is to say, human biology does place certain limitations on what is physically possible. Charles Darwin said, any animal whatever, endowed with well-marked social instincts, the parental and filial affections being here included, would inevitably acquire a moral sense or conscience as soon as its intellectual powers had become as well or nearly as well developed as in man. If our evolutionary origins explain some of the motives undergirding our moral principles, that is important to know, because understanding the source of a moral norm may help us improve upon them. According to psychologist and evolutionary biologist Mark Hauser, evolution built us with a suite of principles and parameters for building moral systems which lack specific content. Those are filled in by the local culture. So while there is some variety, not everything is permitted. He says in his book, Moral Minds, we are endowed with a moral acquisition device. Infants are born with the building blocks for making sense of the causes and consequences of actions, and these early capacities grow and interface with others to generate moral judgments. Infants are also equipped with a suite of unconscious, automatic emotions that can reinforce the expression of some actions while blocking others. Such evolutionary built-in principles in infants exist in development in other social animals, particularly our closest living relative, the chimpanzee. To both an infant and a chimpanzee, if an object meets certain characteristics, if it seems self-propelled, if it seems goal-directed, if it seems to flexibly be responsible to environmental constraints, then that object has the potential to cause harm or comfort to other like-minded objects. And it is something to which we have moral obligations, says both the child and the chimpanzee. Both an infant and a chimp can be tricked into interpreting agency and responding in ethically appropriate ways to non-agents if they fulfill those attributes. One interesting experiment showed that he shows in his book. He presented chimpanzees with images that showed possible actions in response to a problem involving food acquisition. For example, whether a long or a short stick would be useful in acquiring food that was just out of reach. The chimpanzees put the picture representing the correct solution next to the trainer that they liked, and the useless action, for example, using a stick that was too short, beside the trainers that they did not like. This is pretty incredible. Chimps are able to match their own goals and to goals of others, and to use their emotions to choose actions that benefit some and harm others. This capacity is central to morality, as it leads to the strategic use of cooperation with those we like and the rejection of those we don't feel deserve moral obligation. There is evidence of animals, birds, dogs, monkeys, and apes, reading each other's thoughts and emotions, evidence of joint attention, of reading intentions and goals, using seeing to draw inferences about knowing. These are the beginning steps to evolving a theory of mind, and although the science is strong and is quite young, I should say, in some areas, it does hint at the idea that ethical insights, much like other areas of evolution, is not an all-or-nothing duality, but a gradual process of acquisition. Perhaps the notion of evolution slowly building a moral sense is a nice analog to the slow evolution of human civilization, bootstrapping its way in a secular and open society to an enhanced sense of right and wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. It's disconcerting when you're moderating a debate to watch your panelists nodding and smiling as the other is talking. You want to see a lot more eye rolling and gritting of teeth going on. I will, since neither of you used quite your full allotment of time, give each of you about 3 to 4 minutes to respond to each other's comments before moving into comments, questions from me and questions from the audience. So, Eric, if you'd like to go first.
Sure. Thank you, Justin. Obviously, there's a great deal in what you had to say that I agree with deeply, and I don't think there's any debate between us about the importance of democratic, pluralistic, and inclusive societies. I am struck by your modeling of religious ethics as somehow being about a tribal ethic which is unable to see itself from above. And I think there's some interesting questions about the capacity of some of the secular models of ethics on which you draw to do that. You appealed, for example, to Rawls and Rawls' famous theory with its use of the veil of ignorance to try and get an original position so that we don't actually know what place we would hold in a society before we design the society that we're looking to. But as many commentators have pointed out, the society which Rawls ends up designing from that veil of ignorance turns out to be the sort of society that one might expect a middle-class, white, male, North American university professor to find attractive. And this shouldn't surprise us. And I'm not simply trying to belittle Rawls with that. I'm trying to simply observe that actually the task of lifting oneself out of one's own space is actually an extraordinarily difficult one. And to suggest that religionists have failed to do that from time to time is simply to state the obvious. And I'm simply pointing out that those who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. I am struck by your observation that morality is a strategic response from your evolutionary argument. And I would want to observe that at least some secular non-religious moralists would actually find that a quite amoral position. Kant, particularly, who objected to any moral position that came from a motive other than the moral motive. So any attempt to pursue the moral from self-interest and so on is deeply problematic. So he may have some challenges to offer to your evolutionary theorizing. And that really, I guess, because just time is, just let me illustrate one other in terms of context. You talked about the advanced structure of Turkish society relative to societies around. Well, I don't know whether there are any Kurds in the room this evening, but they may have a somewhat different perspective about Turkish society and its implications for them. So, I think we have to be very careful when we draw these generalizations. Let me go back just briefly to the Euthyphro argument with which you began and the thought experiment with Kurtz. I mean, it's a very old experiment and it's a very old thought, and it won't surprise you to know that it's not something that religious believers haven't thought about many times. The trouble with the argument as it appears in the Euthyphro, and the trouble with the argument as Kurtz sets it up, is it actually places the idea that one's moral perception and one's perception of the divine are two separately evolving things, that one has one entirely prior to the other. And the simple fact of the matter is that people grow in their religious perception, they grow in their moral perception in similar ways, and that our moral perceptions are exercised in a world which religious believers was created by God. So it shouldn't exactly be an enormous surprise to us to think that what would be appropriate and moral and good behavior within that world would be something that would be in accordance with some of the things that God would want and wish. And actually the Abraham and Isaac story is an unfortunate one in some ways for Kurtz's argument, because it's probably an etiological legend to show why the Jewish people couldn't practice infant sacrifice as was practiced by surrounding cultures. Most scholars believe that's what, in fact, that text is. So, in fact, its real purpose within the text was quite the opposite of that for which Kurtz is using it. So, that'll do for now.
And there certainly will be more time to discuss points in response to questions from the audience. I'm going to have to encourage you to speak, maybe not into your microphone, but in the direction of your microphone, because otherwise your voice will be trailing. And that prevents you from yelling directly at each other, which maybe is good for the confrontationality of the thing. Justin.
Let me just comment briefly, and now I'm going to go back to much of what you said during your talk and some of your comments just now. As just to the Free Thought Association of Canada slogans, just to clarify, there were two slogans. So yes, there was "You can be good without God," and our slogan, "There's probably no God," etc. You know the rest of it. Both were rejected by Metro Transit. I just wanted to clarify that. The so-called ethic of sort of enjoying your life, relaxing, and all of that's a bit taken the wrong way, and it's easy to do that because, well, it's so short and there's so little context to provide for it. But really, what we're going for there, and this is a bit beyond the bounds of the debate, but I'll say it quickly, is to engage with people who have a position of doubt and skepticism, because to some people that can be scary, that can lead them to question their faith traditions. And what we're saying to those people who happen to find themselves in that position is that doubt, that skepticism is okay to embrace it, sort of take it where it leads you. So it's to them that we're suggesting relax and enjoy your life. I wanted to say a few comments on what you said. You mentioned sort of just in passing social virtues and some studies that had shown correlation between religiosity and that sort of thing. I wanted to point out that one study that I know of in particular, because I was asked to quote on this in the papers about a year or two ago, was done by Reginald Bibby out of Lethbridge, Alberta. And he found that social virtues were linked, that people would have put a higher importance on things like honesty and that sort of thing if they were religious. But one of the comments that I made in response to that was the values that he chose to focus on didn't include things that I would have on that list. Things like acceptance of fallibility, critical thinking, the sort of faculties that I think are important in the open society that I keep speaking about. So I think that Bibby chose values that reflected his religiosity. And I'm not saying that all the studies are like that. I'm simply saying that's one study where I think it was deeply flawed in that sense. I want to comment on the idea of community and communal practices as sort of being something that I've neglected. Well, I haven't really neglected that because I did comment on it. But when I hear people emphasize, community ethics, I always think back to the individual. What of those people inside communities who are vulnerable, have no platform on which to state their problems with that community's ethics? What do they do? That's why I think an open society is so important. That's why I have a fear sometimes, to be honest, with community-based ways of approaching things. What about children who could be harmed? Children, in my opinion, should be able to make up their own minds. They shouldn't be so indoctrinated that they have no options. A lot of people have a problem with our ads because they're afraid that they don't want their children to see anything beyond what they've been taught. And I think children have certain rights too, and I think the ability to have a full and informed series of worldviews thrust at you that you can make your own choice. I think that's a right that every child deserves. So that's why I'm a bit fearful of the insistence on community-based ethics. You mentioned that secular ethics were, overly emphasized nationality, rules, and principles and procedures. That's quite true. There is a motivism, for example. It's a philosophy that takes as its basis motives and desires and emotional drives. Hume, for example, who said, "Let reason be in the service of the passions," or something to that effect. I think he would embrace that sort of thing. That we really can't get to a rational basis for our morals. So I think that's not completely lost in the secular sphere. As far as the Euthyphro argument, if I understand what you were saying in response to that, it was sort of that God would sort of construct human beings in such a way that what they would find to be good would be in keeping with the sort of universe that he was sort of putting into place. Was that not it?
No, not really.
Okay, well, I apologize, and I won't get into that. that is sometimes one of the counterpoints that's made, is that, God, in creating both the universe and its ethical systems as well as the human being, would sort of fit them as if one was a puzzle that would fit it, as if they were puzzle pieces that fit together. You didn't say that, so I'm not gonna go into that, and it has obvious comments that could be made, so I apologize. And I guess I used up my time, so I stop there.
I'd like to thank both of our panelists, while people line up at the mic so that the timing works out with their comments, for their comments so far. They've been at sometimes quite abstract and at sometimes quite visceral and connected to the realities of how we lead lives, and I appreciate both your ability to both do that in a way that's very heady and thinky, but also very meaningful. I'm fortunate to see people lined up at the mics already. So I had planned to ask the panelists some questions of my own at this point, but in the interest of time and in the interest of hearing more from you and less from me, I'll turn over to comments from the floor and maybe interject my thoughts as the evening unfolds.
Thanks very much. I'll direct my question specifically to Mr. Beresford, and if there's time and you're willing, I'll welcome comments from Mr. Trottier on the issue. An objection that I know a lot of people who reject religion-based morality raise is that it's morally dishonest because it's incentive-based, and it's not only not altruistic but ultimately solipsistic. That people who follow a religious, especially Christian-based moral code do so because at the end of the day they don't want to burn in hell and they'd rather go to heaven for themselves. Whereas a secular moralist or a moral secularist at the end of the day isn't good because they want to get into heaven, but is good because they understand, as we all intuitively do, the golden rule, that you're better off being good so you can live peacefully and productively on earth with your fellow man in this one life we have. So if we accept that some people can be good with God and some people can be good without God, can it not at least be argued that people who are good with God aren't really good for the right reasons, whereas those who are good without God are good for at least better reasons? So I'd like to know, how do you, Mr. Beresford, that is to say, how does religion respond to the argument that being moral in a secular way without God is at least more altruistic, more morally honest, and thus more desirable a way to live for anyone?
So to Eric, on behalf of all religion, I guess.
Yeah, on behalf of all religion, yes. Gosh. And I thought I was just president of a little theological school. Never mind. The short answer is you actually told me, as you framed the question, that the secularists are also being good for ulterior motive. For the sort of society they produce. Justin suggested that it was an evolutionary drive. So again, it's about survival. So in fact, both religionists and non-religionists sometimes give non-ethical reasons for being ethical. And I'd want to suggest that when they do that, not only, if you're a religionist, not only are you being less ethical than you ought to be, but you're also not paying close enough attention to what's actually being asked of us ethically and morally within certainly the scriptural tradition, where in fact we're asked not to do things for fear of hell or for hope of heaven, but because it is precisely the right thing to do. Because it's about participating in that which we bring about by the good things we do. So, I would agree with you that some people have that rather, if you like, naive Sunday school religion approach to things, but I don't think that necessarily defines how religious people do it. And I think, at the same time, there's clear evidence of so-called secular moralists offering us ulterior motives. And one of the interesting things to me, actually, if I just may add this, is in fact that's one of the things that happens when we're concerned to try and justify ethics. See, one of the things that happens in the history of ethical debate is we find ourselves trying to prove why we should be good. That's one of the things that Kant and Mill are dealing with, for example. The minute we've allowed ourselves to go down that road, we've watered down the possibility of a truly moral life, in my view. So I think this actually links to some of the rational structures that I was being critical of.
Thanks very much.
Justin, did you have anything to add to that?
Very briefly, because I totally agree with you. I was going to say the same sort of thing, that it's more complicated on both sides of the spectrum. Certainly secularists have ulterior motives and want to live in a good society and I guess in a sense, a non-violent society can be sort of selfish, although, well, I'll have to think more about that one, but I agree with you for the moment. But just to defend sort of the evolutionary basis of ethics, I wasn't suggesting that by understanding evolution, we can construct perfect moral codes and that evolution is really just to explain that there are certain constraints on what we can and cannot expect based on our biology, based on the way our brains work and that sort of thing. It's just, it can be a constraint on what we can expect when we build an ethical system, and it can sort of tell us what our motives are. And that's informative, not to say that it's the be-all and end-all. It can be a starting point, though, I think.
Thank you. To the next commenter.
First, quickly, I want to suggest that the slogan on the buses should have been, "It is possible to be good with God." And that would have left the onus on the religious people, and I think that they wouldn't reject it, but it would have made the same point even more powerfully. I think it's funny, but anyways, I think any kind of absolute authority is dangerous as a base for morality, and God, by definition, is such an entity, because that leads to possible mob morality, which is very often described in the Bible, like stoning people to death. It's a morality of the cowards who follow the mob. Because there's absolute authority, there is no option but to be a coward if you cannot contest the authority. It's just absolutely optionless. Now, I want to point out, I had the experience of some 50 years ago, a little more than that, living in a kibbutz as a young adult.
And as you're speaking, I should point out that you're quite close to.
I don't see a lineup here. So let's be rational and not absolutist. Okay. Now, in my experience, in the kibbutz, which happened to be founded by 90% atheist doctors, there were a few people who chose to join and believed in God, but that was a very, very small minority. You could hardly notice them. It was the most moral society I've experienced in my life, and everything was discussed, contested, and debated on regular kibbutz meetings. Actually, there's two kibbutzim that were adjacent to each other that I had for a few years the experience to live in. There was no crime that I know of, and this organization particularly, that is more atheistic in the kibbutz movement, included hundreds of kibbutzim. They are the most peace-orientated movement in the country. They are the ones that were willing to make concessions for peace. The overall global conscientiousness of what is good is based on empathy and broad compassion was very apparent in every aspect of living in this kibbutz, So what I want to suggest again, that in a society that is based on not non-absolute authority, but rather as organic quest as a base for morality, I saw it succeeding very well as a highly social, highly cultural, and also science motivating environment. So that's what to me suggests clearly that it is possible to have a system where society has a very moral way of living without God. On the other hand, I think it will be a lot harder to have a society where morality is based on God, simply because if the foundation is empathy, at least if it's empathy and broad compassion as a base for good, if we see it that way. Now, that's a question, of course, what is good? Because some people think good is what's good for God. Now, if that's a base, then it is a lot more difficult because religious people are in a conflict. Should we do what's good according to this basis, or should we do what God expects us? And since God, naturally, since He made the universe in few days, If we blow it up, next time you may do it in a few seconds. You know what I mean? So
I'd like to give the panelists an opportunity to respond to your comments. Thank you.
Okay, I suppose the quick thing to observe is even if God's an absolute authority, no human being who actually understands what it means to be in relationship with God can be. We do not see the world from God's perspective. St. Paul talks about walking by faith and not by sight. And I think there's another side to this that has to be remembered, and that's the authority that's attributed to reason. Let me illustrate what I mean by that by saying something about the nature of debate as opposed to dialogue. In debate, the task is to identify true statements, differentiate them from false, and to remove statements that are false. Debates privilege assertion over relationship. Dialogue begins in a recognition of the dialogue partner that you are in relationship with. Dialogue privileges relationship and tailors assertion to what will be helpful in terms of building understanding within that relationship. The trouble with a focus on a debate-orientated, rationalistic understanding of truth is, frankly, in the end, it too becomes authoritarian. Because in the end, if I know the truth, and I know I have the stronger arguments, then I have the authority to remove the people who have the weaker arguments. And moving from removing the arguments to removing the people is a very small step. And it's one that has been crossed in human history more than once. I think it's not just religious people who are capable of authoritarianism and some of the things that it does.
Justin, did you have anything to add?
The only thing I wanted to add to that is, I mean, yes, of course, I agree you can have authoritarian leaders emerge in secular and religious societies. I do go back to what I said. I do think that a secular society that has this common stock of reason, although reason is not the be-all and end-all, from which we can sort of perch up and look at the different ethics of different communities within it and sort of come to some sort of, I don't know if consensus is ever going to happen, but at least dialogue. Yeah, dialogue's good. I think that the values of scientific inquiry actually are very important to that, and I've mentioned them already. Fallibility is key, understanding that you can be wrong. Not to say that only atheists have fallibility, just that is an element, I think, of an open society. And religious and non-religious folks can engage with that understanding, and I think we'd agree it makes for a better dialogue. So I think we can, if we move away from authoritarian structures to contain that dialogue, then that's what's key, more than anything else. I think we can agree pretty much on that.
Thank you. I want to move to now there is a bit of a line building, so the next... All
right, to cut it short, Immanuel Kant has been dead for almost 200 years. So to both Eric and Justin, what do you think of the secular atheist thinkers of postmodernism who would possibly agree with Eric that you cannot find a single universal grounding for morals within a community, but they would also argue that you cannot simply suggest that God serves as a common foundation for any community to develop? For example, the freethinker and novelist Kurt Vonnegut wrote all about societies that invented their own gods. And, I mean, they had all sorts of different philosophies, from the laissez-faire of, well, just have fun and enjoy your life, to authoritarianism. But in any circumstance, when you say I'm being moral because I share a foundation with someone else in my community, you can end up being very destructive.
I have a friend back in Toronto, and every time we get together, we engage on postmodernism because I'm not a fan of it, and I don't think he is really either, but he says I don't understand it, so he engages with me. Maybe I don't. But from what I understand, what permeates it is this notion that, as you said, there's no ultimate truth, and that I think I do agree with. There's no absolute truth. But they would also say that all truths are, in a sense, objective to you, and even science is but another myth or narrative that we use that because it's useful in certain situations. And I think that's wrong. I think that science, in some ways, is the best method. It is, qualitatively better than other methods of approaching physical reality. Maybe not ethics, to be sure, but postmodernists would probably say that. Would maybe reject science as a better method in any sphere. So I definitely am not a postmodernist in that sense. And they would certainly, I think, reject reason. I don't want to paint all postmodernists with one brush, but from what I understand, reject reason and any value with which we can, as I said, perch up and sort of examine things with a common stock of values from above. I think it's a dangerous philosophy, too, because it does lead to this new age movement in which, everybody creates their own reality because one reality or truth is no better than any other. And, hey, I guess that means that if your life is really, really bad, you must have created that, and maybe you deserve it. I've seen a lot of people make that leap to that belief. Things like The Secret, if anybody's read that book, the idea is I haven't read it, so this is hearsay, I guess. But correct me if I'm wrong, is the idea not that we control our own destinies to the extent that we can actually wish fulfill certain things even beyond the physical universe? Is that not it? Well, in the sense that there is sort of there's no scientific truth to anything, and everybody's reality is equal to everybody else's. I think that can be quite dangerous.
I also don't think it's got anything to do with postmodernism, at least not as explicated by thinkers like Derrida, Foucault, and people like this, Levinas, and so on. The point really, remember, postmodernism isn't something that comes after modernism. What postmodernism is fundamentally is when modernity becomes aware of its own aporia, its own problems, the things it tends to exclude. And so it's not actually saying we can construct our own realities. It's actually saying quite the opposite. We can't get out of the reality within which we're constructed by the societies we are constructed by the normal rational techniques that modernity has deployed. And so what's being suggested here is, in fact, it's actually in many ways a return to rhetoric, the importance of rhetoric alongside logic, which is a very ancient insight. And what you see in a writer like Derrida, for example, is the move to rhetorical devices to unsettle the center, so reading from the margins. Reading between the words, not just reading the words. Why? Because he wants to draw our attention to, in text and so on, what's left unsaid. Because often it's just as important as what's left said. In terms of the original question and the reference to God as a foundation for ethics, I would say that's one of the problems which religionists have created for themselves. And I think in this one, my own view is Nietzsche's right, that the consequence of turning God merely into the guarantor of our moral lives is in fact to evacuate the divine of any real content, and in fact to walk right into the argument that was quoted earlier, the Euthyphro argument. If you read Also sprach Zarathustra, for example, when Nietzsche outlines for us the death of God, what does he say? And remember, by the way, Nietzsche's own background, very important here. He was raised in a Lutheran manse. And it's almost certain that his notion of the death of God came from a Lutheran hymn, God selbst ist tot. It's a Good Friday hymn. What does he say there? He says, God is dead and we have killed him. And who declares the death of God? Well, it turns out to be that last great seeker after God. And who killed God? It was the theologians. Why? Because they turned him into the God of morality. And so there was really nothing left that was genuinely transcendent. God served a purpose in our world rather than us facing a transcendent God who decentered us and made us see the world differently. And in other words, created precisely the sense of that which we cannot fully speak of, which I think many postmodernists are drawing attention to. It's interesting to note that theologians have actually been drawing very heavily over recent years on the works of people like Derrida, Levinas, Foucault, and their predecessors, people like Heidegger and so on. Why? Because they're seeing there ways of thinking that get us beyond some of the impasses that we're in within modern culture as it's been set up, and its authoritarianisms. And we don't even notice them. Let me give you one quick example. The concept of property. That's kind of obvious. We all know what we mean by property, don't we? It's kind of value-free and neutral and pretty straightforward. Well, actually it isn't. The concept of property as we use it in Canadian society has an origin. Its origin lies in Locke's third treatise on government. And what was Locke doing when Locke defined property the way he did? Well, he was trying to give us a non-theological definition of property. Well, that's one thing. But the other thing he was doing was he was justifying the land grab that was going on in the Americas. If you're an indigenous person, you cannot see that as a value-free understanding of property. And basically, what I take from the postmodernists is the recognition that there is no view from nowhere for any of us, and that all of us need to be very conscious of that and what that's going to mean in terms of how we hear or avail ourselves of voices other than our own.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Thank you both for interesting presentations. My question is for Mr. Trottier, and it concerns your statement that secular society needn't be an atheistic or anti-religious society. It can be pluralistic and treat religious traditions with respect and so forth. And I can see why you would want to say that, but I think in the end it doesn't make any sense. Religious doctrines concern the most important issues that there are. Do we owe our existence to a perfect creator who deserves our worship and obedience? What are the creator's plans for us in the universe? What does the creator, the perfect creator of the universe, approve of, disapprove of, condemn, and want us to do? How could somebody who thinks he or she knows the answers to those questions treat them as purely private, personal matters? Those answers bear upon public policy, if anything does. So I think secularism really is committed to not taking seriously true religious belief and regarding religious doctrines as either false or at least not known to be true. But since among the religious doctrines are the claims that they are known to be true, you've got to regard religion as false if you're to be a consistent secularist. It would be nice to be able to be pluralistic and secular, but I don't think in the end it makes any consistent sense.
Justin?
Thank you for that. Yeah, I do agree that there are a lot of atheists and secularists, I suppose, who don't take religious belief seriously and want to marginalize it in the public space. But I also think that there's another strand of atheism, of secularism, which suggests that the open space, pages of a newspaper, government committees, all these places where people come together to debate these issues, that the open space, that there's no reason why we can't have religious and non-religious values both be in that space and have dialogues with each other. I'm not sure why, of necessity, a secular society would ultimately have to reject religion. All it would say is that the laws of the land should not privilege or create an infrastructure in which religious belief is deemed to be, or any one worldview, I should say, is deemed to be above any other and should get special government treatment. So I would submit that a secular society wouldn't fund publicly religious schooling, because in effect what you're doing is you're taking tax money from people who don't share a belief and you're using it to, in a sense, educate, some might say indoctrinate somebody else's children. I don't think you can justify that in a secular open society. Another example might be the use of prayers to commence legislative meetings or town hall meetings. I don't think that can be defended. But to suggest that politicians can't talk about religion, even talk about religion inside the legislature, no, I'm not an atheist who would say that. But they can't create laws which would disadvantage the non-believers within the legislature, within the community. So I think there is that distinction between government-endorsed religiosity and the simple acceptance of religious discussions in the public space.
Eric, did you?
I think I just want to be careful on the other side that we don't create a space where religionists can't live alongside people who don't share their committed, deeply held and believed positions. I've been involved quite a lot in public policy conversations in Canada, and it seems to me that there are all sorts of ways that people of religious faith can bring their faith to bear in discussions with people who do not share their faith and find common ground. And I think that's an important and useful thing to do. So I wouldn't want to, and frankly, as a Christian, I'd also want to say that the God who created me created all the people I don't agree with, and believes that they are good and wonderful and a delight to God. So, I've got to live with that, and that means actually also recognizing that some of those people may actually have insights which I need to hear as a person of faith, because I'm not listening as clearly as I ought to be. So I want to leave open that space. Remember, it's kind of a sort of thing I keep sort of saying over and over again. We walk by faith, not by sight. Only God has God's perspective of the world. We don't. And so we participate in it. And we need to also be surprised sometimes about where grace comes from, where we see God active. That seems to be one of the fundamental messages of the New Testament, for example. The woman who comes in and she's at Jesus' feet and she's bathing his feet in tears. And the religious person says, if he knew what sort of woman he was, he wouldn't let her touch him. But Jesus turns that round to say, no, this is the moment of grace. If somebody forgives you 500 denarii and somebody forgives you 100, who loves the most? The person who was forgiven the most. And he actually calls this religious leader to see that actually there's a moment of grace, there's a moment of revelation that's coming from a place that person wasn't expecting it to come from. And I think we need to be open to that happening again and again and again.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think my question's directed mostly to Eric, but I'd like Justin's voice on it too after, if possible. I was interested in your discussion of, relational ethics in terms of the religion, because I think it really mirrors what's happening in ethics generally, and I think that the utilitarianism and deontology are falling away to a certain extent, and relational ethics, one example being Irish Young's social connection model, is kind of taking over, where explicitly taking into account where people fit in the structure of society is an important factor in deciding things. So I just wasn't clear, though, because it still seemed at the end of your discussion that it was the relationship with God that was allowing people to be good. And so I was just wondering what it was that would allow people to be good without God, if it would be relationally, or how that worked exactly. Because I know at the beginning you said that you did believe that people could be good without God, but I wasn't sure exactly how that would be when you described the relational ethics in terms of religion, I suppose.
What I said at the beginning, I was referring very specifically to both the capacity for moral insight and moral behavior. Non-believers. I know lots of non-believers who are intensely good people and who have really compelling insight into the moral life. And I want to say that doesn't surprise me, frankly. If God created the world in which I live, including those believers, why shouldn't I expect to see echoes of God's will and desire coming out all over the place? This is very ancient sort of ways of Christians thinking about things. So that's fine. What I was doing, though, was taking us away from this sort of moral theorizing about what's good and what isn't to sets of practices that are communally based, and which and I speak for my own community here, and others need to speak for their communities, which have their roots in a particular understanding of how the relationship with God shapes my relationship with other people. For example, the notion of equality. I mean, it's been said a couple of times about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights being a fundamentally secular document. Well, the original of that is sitting in McGill as we speak, and that's not a secular document. It does actually refer to God, quite clearly. And that's quite clearly shaped how that document was shaped. A particular conception of our relationship with the divine said, even though people are not equal in intelligence, not equal in strength, not equal in health, not equal in wealth, not equal in social position, they're equal. And that came from a particular vision. Now, I'm trying to say I don't believe it's necessarily true that that's the only place that can come from. I'm trying to say that I don't believe that our relationship with the divine and our experience of reconciliation through the divine is the only thing that can set us on the path of recognizing that moral communities need to experience reconciliation. But I've yet to see another model for it, especially that last one. I've yet to see a secular moral philosopher take seriously the need to deal with what happens after moral failure, and to set up models and directions for moving forward through that. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm saying I haven't seen it.
Justin, did you have anything in response to it?
Get to the next question.
Hi, guys. Thank you both for coming. Justin, I'm sorry. This is, again, going to be a question directed at Eric. Eric, I'm troubled by something that you had said a few minutes ago, and so I want to come out in defense of debate and in defense of what I believe is more deeply of science. You had said that when the force of someone's argument began to give them power over someone else, and that they were able to overwhelm the other person's position with either the force of their accumulated evidence or the strength of their reasoning, that it was a short step from removing that person's voice to removing that person. And I think that that's precisely and exquisitely backwards. I think that this has been the great triumph of science, is that when it is no longer the social obligation, the politics, the understanding of what is owed and what is feared to another person that dictates the way a conversation flows and the way information flows back and forth between two people, when instead of that it is the force of fact, the force of argument, and the volume of information, I think that there's no longer a need to remove the person who is opposing you, because the information that you have at your disposal renders them helpless. So I think it's in the past, people have been removed because there were no good reasons for shutting down their voice, and so you needed to remove them physically. I think this has been the triumph of science, and this is the great danger of dialogue over debate. And I think it does carry into our discussion earlier, especially what Justin was saying about the evolutionary underpinnings of morality. It's not until we understand those things and bring the weight of reason to bear that we can have some semblance of an objective acquisition of what might actually help people, what might make people feel good or generate the most happiness. So those are my thoughts, and I'd like to know what you make of that.
Do you know Barbara McClintock?
Pardon me?
Do you know the name Barbara McClintock?
I don't.
Barbara McClintock was a cell biologist. She, in fact, was the first woman ever to receive the Nobel Prize for Medicine on her own. However, her career was blighted by the fact that what she was interested in researching on was how the relationships between cells affects how genetic information is expressed. Her scientific theories were called unorthodox, which is scientific speak for unlikely to be true. She never had a permanent position. She never had a position in a university. She never had a tenure stream position. She was removed. And I want to point out that actually that does happen in science. Science has its orthodoxies too. I don't speak as a critic of science. Let me just lay something out here for people, and that is my first degrees are in genetics. I'm passionate about science and the good things that science does for us. But I think we also need to recognize that science is a social practice that's funded, that has politics, that has personalities, and that has certain orthodoxies which can be very difficult to overcome sometimes. I remember once in sixth form a biology master saying to me, the definition of a great scientist, Eric, is somebody who can hold up the progress of science for the longest possible time. And by that definition, Newton was a brilliant scientist because his approximations were so good that it really took until we were dealing with the infinitely small or massively large before we realized they broke down. But when they began to break down in the early days of that, there was a fair amount of scoffing at people who were beginning to question Newtonian mechanics. Now, the people who questioned Newtonian mechanics proved to be right, and they're now the ones we remember as the hero in the story. But if we were having this conversation in 1912, it would be a very different conversation. And Barbara McClintock's a lot more recent than that. So, I'm not trying to, I don't want to overpaint this. All I want to say is that certain types of rationalism can also be very authoritarian and exclusivist, as well as certain forms of religion. And I want to join Justin in rejecting both. And I think join you in that as well.
I am going to comment on that, if I may, very quickly. Absolutely, there are horror stories in science. But I would say that science, yes, is community-based in the sense that it's performed by people. People are not always going to meet the ideals of the community that they're trying to represent. So I agree with you on that. But I think that the values of science are what the open society requires in most cases. And I mentioned those already: fallibility and ability to listen to others in dialogue and all that. I think science exists between two extremes, and Carl Sagan, who's one of my heroes, he made this very eloquent. I won't be able to do justice to it, but basically the extremes are, on the one hand, we consider everything, this is the ideal scientist, right? We consider all new claims that are put before us, but on the other hand, we have a deep skepticism to any and every claim. So how do you reconcile that? Well, it's very difficult, and sometimes novelty doesn't get accepted as quickly as it should, and that's when there are what Thomas Kuhn refers to as a paradigm shift between the sudden acceptance of one paradigm over another. Sometimes it doesn't work as smoothly as one would have liked, but it's the result of that dichotomy, and I think that's a very healthy dichotomy. Usually it works quite well. And just to comment in general about free speech, because it does touch on what you said, I think free speech is great. I mean, I think we just had a rally yesterday about that, and what scares me are instances of censorship, because I think that's really what science can contribute to dialogue in a broader sense. We're not just talking about debates about stem cell research and actual science debates, but just that value of openness to new ideas and free speech, I think, is very key to all discussions like these.
Thank you.
Yes, I want to thank you folks for bringing this wonderful academic discussion that we're all quite seemingly agreed on many points. I'm a community college instructor, and I heard of some talk about pedagogy, and this debate tonight was perhaps instigated by something in the public space, some posters on a bus. And the challenge that I have, funded by the province of Nova Scotia, is to take the ideas of the academics and come up with a curriculum to, as has been the case in Nova Scotia for at least 100 years, to put in the public education a moral compass, some sense of ethics, and so on. I'm very much in favor of critical thinking in the work that we do under public funding, and I wonder, since it is under public funding, and maybe it's been put in the public space because maybe there's some contention for that funding. I would propose that if you were to send me away tomorrow to propose a game plan, I would say, well, the Judeo-Christian model, in many areas, is quite proven, and I can get lots of documentation. I feel very strong that the Judeo-Christian model would work well in the Nova Scotia classrooms. I would encourage critical thinking of that model, and that may not make Justin happy, but perhaps you can propose, Justin, a better way to bring the working with a time established set of ideas that we can critically think about. Wouldn't that be the best way to spend the province's money to bring morals and ethics into the schools of this province, as opposed to a lot of ideas from everywhere, which we would get to sometime? I'll need to have Eric and Justin both comment on how I'm going to spend your money in the public schools.
I'd like to ask it. Sorry, I was going to ask Justin to go first. I see you already passing it off, but...
Yeah. In Ontario and certain other provinces, there's been publicly funded Catholic schooling and public subsidies to all sorts of religious schools. And as I said in answer to another person's question earlier, I'm not in favor of that. I don't think that a secular society ought to be funding the religious education of its citizens. I don't think taxpayers who don't agree with the worldview that's being inculcated ought to be funding that. Quebec went the route slowly over the last decade of removing their funding to their Catholic school system, publicly funded Catholic school system. They now have just what I think you would enjoy, a world religions and ethics course. I'm not sure if you were sort of getting at having Judeo-Christianity permeate the entire structure of the school system. I would totally think that would be a big mess. But having a world religions class, and I think it's actually mandatory in Quebec, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I'm all in favor of that. One problem I do have is that I'm not sure that there is as much critical thinking as we would hope in that class. We have colleagues that I work with, the Humanist Association of Quebec, and I can only go by their reports. They've looked at it in detail, and they report to me that humanism and atheism and critiques of traditional religion is not given much place in the course. And if that's true, I think that's missing a very valuable insight. I think you might agree when you talked about looking at things critically. So yes, I'm all in favor of having that educational, that ethical educational class, but I think it's also important to realize that there are, secular alternatives too, and it does imply to the students at least that there are no valid critiques of religious ethics, and I think that's unfair. So with that caveat, I would agree with that sort of implementation.
While I was at McGill, I was required to teach a course called Comparative Religious Ethics. I really didn't enjoy teaching that course because one of the things that became very clear to me very early on is that what that ended up modeling, if you weren't careful, was the imposition of basically Western intellectual models, whether it be utilitarianism or Kantianism or any of these sorts of models, over religious traditions to which they are quite foreign. Now, clearly, Buddhism has a commitment to a moral life and articulates that in a number of ways. So does Hinduism. But the categories by which we shape our ethical discourse often don't fit very comfortably over those. Now, I want to suggest that one of the difficulties here is actually establishing, therefore, that critical perspective. Because the critical perspective turns out to be the assumed intellectual stances of basically European culture, as derived from the Enlightenment. So that critical perspective turns out not to be, in my view, anything like critical enough. It needs to go further. And I suppose I'd also want to say that at the end of the day, I don't actually think that those particular intellectual structures that come from that discipline we call ethics fit that comfortably over the history of Christianity either, and over the history of Christian thought. What I ended up doing, interestingly enough, was teaching the course in terms of exemplars of religious virtue. And I took two. St. Francis of Assisi, a bit of an outsider, a bit of a rebel, a bit of a rogue in some ways. And Mahatma Gandhi. Very different characters. But the point was, what I was trying to do in the last version of the course was find a way of reading these characters from within them, their own time and place and history and commitments. And then asking the question, now these great ethical theories that we bring over onto them, are they actually illuminating or actually are they unhelpful? I think the general conclusion was actually they're quite unhelpful. And so that's why at the beginning of this whole session I had some quite critical things to say about moral theorizing. It's not that I'm opposed to rationality, I'm not at all. It's not that I want to find a place away from that. It's that I actually want to find a more profound set of critiques than simply those that we've assumed from our culture, which, by the way, have carried into them in all sorts of ways Judeo-Christian assumptions, which some of my atheist colleagues might want to look more closely at.
The next speaker, please.
Hi. This question is mostly for Eric. The vast majority of religions in the world either support or require the belief in the supernatural, which by definition means unknowable through scientific understanding. Do you believe this is a positive or negative effect on a person's life and society in general?
Thank you, very succinct.
I believe in all sorts of things that aren't accessible to scientific understanding. If I were to test my love for my wife scientifically on a regular basis, I can guarantee the relationship wouldn't last too long. The reality is we can't limit our lives to scientific understanding. There are scientists who are careful and good scientists don't universalize the claims or the rationality of science into areas where scientific insight is not an expertise. And I would say the same thing about the relationship with God. I'm quite resistant to the attempts to prove God's existence, because I think at the end of the day, what we end up with is a God in a box, a God who's frankly too small. Yes, God is not scientifically provable, because the only God who would be worth worshipping would necessarily be beyond such proof. Anything smaller than that is really my own creation. And I think, a critic of religion once said that it's not so much that God made human beings in God's image as much as human beings have too often made God in their own. And without wanting to say that that's true of all religion, clearly, because I don't think it's true of all religion, I think it's a danger which those of us who are people of faith face, especially when we try and prove it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. My question relates to faith, Paul Tillich was a theologian, which you're probably very familiar with, Eric. He spoke of faith as the state of being ultimately concerned. My question to both panelists is it possible to have faith in science? And if that is the case, is there a possibility of science lapsing into a kind of fundamentalism as well? Thank you.
Yes. Sort of more, I think, targeted at me in any case. I don't, it's hard to come at an answer to that because I don't know what people mean when they use the word faith. I mean, there's so many different definitions. But to me, it typically is used to mean, and maybe this is a generalization on my part, but a belief in something for which the evidence is either lacking or non-existent, and perhaps not even possibly existent in a scientific sense. Is that too much of a generalization, do you think?
It wouldn't match what I understand by faith, but go ahead.
Okay. That's fair. And so maybe there's a common ground we could come to by understanding each other's definitions. But I always see faith and science as almost polar opposites in that sense, that science is concerned with the physical universe and approaching questions from a position of methodological naturalism. And I'm not sure that it can deal with questions that are beyond that. So in that sense, I do think that there's some sort of compartmentalization that does work. Although I think the non-overlapping magisteria that Stephen Jay Gould talks about is very difficult in principle to actually hold to. I think it could be a possibility. Maybe it depends again on definitions. I don't know. But I don't know what a scientific fundamentalist or radical would look like. I mean, it would be, as I said, there's this, Carl Sagan talks about this duality, this tension between, consideration of all new claims, but also deep-seated skepticism of all new knowledge and new novelty. It's hard to see how you can be a fundamentalist when you're pulled in those two directions, because I think that does tend to balance itself in a healthy way. So I'm not sure what a fundamentalist of the science, what a I don't know, there's this religion of science, scientism. I'm not sure what a fundamentalist scientismist would actually look like, but maybe we can flesh that out.
I think it would be somebody who applies scientific reason to areas where scientific reason is actually unhelpful. And I think there are certainly people who extend the findings of science and generalize it well beyond the context of science itself, and well beyond the actual limits of their findings. And there's certainly evidence of that. Richard Dawkins, very important figure during my genetics education in terms of his work on selfish gene theory. But the way he's generalized that in some ways leaves many of his fellow geneticists and biologists kind of reeling, not because they think he's a bad scientist, but because they think he's making claims that have gone way beyond what could be justified merely by science. I think one of the realities is that science has some real context that it has to deal with. I find more helpful the work of people like Richard Lewontin, in terms of looking at the limits of scientific rationality and what its place might be, and some of the dangers of the universalizing of scientific rationality. Perhaps his best-known book is Biology as Ideology, and I'd commend that.
Thank you.
A wonderful chess game. It's also like figure skating. I want to hold up points for artistic impression and technical execution. It's about 50-50. I'm part of the Joe Howe Initiative. My name's Al Chaddock. And we try to promote awareness of the fact that Halifax is the birthplace of freedom of the press and public education, free to all and accessible to all. And this whole issue, of course, can we be good without God? That's a ding on sich, because God and good come from the same root word, so it's not really an answerable question anyway, and it would be an interesting game. It's like, why is a raven like a writing desk in Lewis Carroll? It's a question, but you can't answer it, and probably that's true of all of life, and that's why it's asked. I do think it's lovely that we have thought-provoking questions or statements that don't hurt anybody and that are put out in the interest of a public good, which was Joe Howe's number one concern, on Halifax transit buses. This is delightful. This is a wonderful concept. Imagine looking at something that's doing a snow job on your mind and trying to sell you something. Right? Be it religious prejudice or, some kind of new feminine product or whatever. Imagine if people on the buses would be talking like this for a half hour on their way home. They might not want to get off the bus. I mean, really. So, I think this is marvelous, and I commend St. Mary's for doing this. I am leery, of course, of St. Mary's University being a bastion of free thought. Yeah. But I would like to just leave you with a joke I'm going to plagiarize from a lovely little book my friend Charles loaned me called Plato and a Platypus Walk into a Bar. I recommend it highly. It's two Harvard philosophy profs using humor to illustrate the evolution of philosophy and a lot of theology. And by the way, if God is undescribable in all religions, what the heck are they all arguing about? I've never figured that out. Anyway, so 4 rabbis get together on the Sabbath, usually on the back patio behind the synagogue, and they have coffee and discuss anything and everything. And it always turns out that 3 gang up against 1. And it's always a different 1, but somebody's always in the outs. And this one day, one rabbi is just so convinced he's right. And it's a beautiful sunny day, and he says, I just know I'm right, and it's for their own good that they know that I am right. So please, God, give me a sign. And from out of nowhere comes a dark cloud and blocks the sun for 5 minutes and then just disappears. And he says, you see, God agrees with me. That was a sign. Oh, come on, it's just a coincidence, the other guys say. Oh, God, give me a better sign. A hurricane comes from out of nowhere, goes on for 5 minutes, and then just disappears. He says, now, is that enough of a sign? One of the rabbis of the 3 said, well, it's quite a sign, but it's still 3 against 2. Keep this up. This is wonderful. Keep it happening. Get these questions on the buses, and whoever wants to stop these things from being on the buses, find them another job.
I'm not sure that was intended for much of a response from either of the two of you, so I'll move to the next.
Thank you.
My question is for Mr. Trottier. And isn't your idea of an open society sort of a contradiction? Because to you, this open society is one where the government does not favor any ethical system. However, what if your ethical system believes that the government should favor your ethical system? So you brought up, let's say, I think it was Turkey, and you brought up Sweden versus communist Russia. But when you say these are better societies, that is because you are making an ethical judgment that compulsion by force is not a virtue. But what if you believe compulsion by force is a virtue?
Justin.
Well, here's my response to that. If you think that compulsion by force is a virtue, put that slogan on the side of a bus, and we can talk about it. And if you're able to get enough people to vote in a government that wants to create an autocratic state, then I guess that they'll have to live by that. But I think you'll find a lot of people will be relatively angry, and they'll put up bus slogans too, and we'll have a discussion, and most people with that point of view will be quickly overwhelmed by more rationally minded people. So I have faith, if you want to use that word, in the rationality and the good sense of the citizenry to deal with those sorts of claims that I have little respect for personally.
But why is an ethics that believes compulsion by force is not a virtue any more reasonable than the opposite? Can you objectively say, right? Like, can you objectively say that one is right and one is wrong?
Well, I think if you have a society in which I'm not even sure how that society would like hold itself together. So I'm not even sure we could talk about a society that practiced that. It seems like a contradiction because a government like that who would make decisions? Wouldn't the government itself just collapse if everybody in government each was able to live by that, there would be no sense in which anything could get done. One person would tell person A would tell person B to do something, person B would say no, and that would be fine according to your logic, because each person has their own sort of autocracy. You couldn't even build a coherent society. So I think a society that would actually take that to its logical conclusion would be something of a contradiction in terms. It might just logically fall apart. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, I think I'm prepared to say no. Actually, that's the idea that the use of force to impose views on people is good is objectively wrong. Okay, I'm prepared to go that far. Why am I prepared to do that? Not because I just out of some sort of strange religious quirk. I'm prepared to do that because I actually believe that there are, in fact, goods that are external to and independent of whatever my view of them happens to be. And I happen to think that I'm sometimes right about those goods and I'm sometimes wrong about them. But there is a historical trajectory. I think it's better that women have the vote than don't have the vote. I think it's a good. I think it's good that slavery ended. I think that's a good. Now, the trouble with your position as I hear it is it sounds to me like a form of simple relativism where, everybody's perception is equal. Everybody's good is the same. And I simply find that position to be, in the end, untenable. Because actually, I don't think, the slaughter of 6 million Jews just happened to be someone else's perspective. I couldn't possibly hold that. I have to, if I'm going to take any moral seriousness with regard to the world I live in, hold that some things are right and some things are wrong. Now, there are some things which we don't debate. And the reason we don't debate them is because we all agree. We all agree that the torture of children is a bad thing. You'll find no literature in ethics about the torture of children, not because it's morally insignificant, but because it's morally obvious. And I think I would want to say that a society which builds itself simply by force and suasion of force is morally bankrupt. And it's unable to actually articulate its own good, because if it could articulate its own goods, it wouldn't need to force them on people.
I'm going to have to be very conscious of time at this point and move on to the next commenter. And unfortunately, that is going to have to be the last comment or question for the
Thank
evening. You. I'm not responsible for that.
Thank you, Eric, for your previous comments. I think it brought my question into focus. I think you do have an argument why we can't be good without God, or at least why it's really very difficult to be good without God. And I think it goes something like this, that disinterested inquiry into matters of value puts commitment at risk. That if we investigate our values dispassionately or disinterestedly, try to understand what they are, we fall into something like a non-cognitivism. And the non-cognitivist lacks the will, the resources, whatever, to act. And for that reason, community will suffer. On your view, it seems it's better that we leave certain avenues of inquiry, that we don't walk down certain avenues of inquiry, that we don't ask certain questions. You used the term unhelpful a few times when you said, well, it's unhelpful to look at it this way. I think your point is that it's actually destructive to look at it that way, that a society of atheists would very soon become a society of non-cognitivists. It would be a struggle of preference against preference, and community would be lost. I'm putting words in your mouth, but is that an argument that you're...
I'm not sure I take it quite as far as you do, but I think the first point you make is important, because we can't doubt everything at once. That was in the end, in my view, the problem with Descartes. He thinks he's doubting everything at once, and he arrives at cogito ergo sum, but sum suddenly seems to be full of all sorts of content which he actually can't derive from his method of universal doubt. And it needs to be for him to get anywhere else. It needs to be for him to even begin to build any sort of rational understanding of a moral world. It's even true in science. Science isn't just about methodological doubt. It's also at one level about faith. What we do with young scientists is we train them in the orthodoxies of science for for the first number of years before we really set them loose to start to say, now, challenge stuff. But, one of the signs of a good scientist is knowing what to challenge first, what to doubt first, and what, from a good gut reason, you're going to hold on to for now. We can't doubt everything all at once. So yes, I think I would want to say that any helpful way of proceeding involves not just doubt but faith. Now, whether that's faith in God or whether something else can be constructed which prevents one falling into that sort of solipsism that you're describing, well, it's not for me to defend another way of avoiding that solipsism. It's for other people to defend that. I'm not close to the possibility. What I would want to say, and here I'd echo Charles Taylor, the well-known philosopher from McGill, that in the end it would probably fall down to what I would call a best available account principle. I don't doubt that it's possible to put together a purely atheistic account of the good life, but is it really the best account that we're able to give of that life?
It certainly is. As a committed non-cognitivist, yes.
Sorry?
As a ethically committed non-cognitivist, I think it's a wonderful life, and it's a challenging. What's challenging is to make it real to others.
Thank you for that. I'm sensing we have the appetite for at least one more comment or question. Okay. At the risk of taxing your patience, I'll ask them to be quite short, but maybe we have the appetite for two.
Hi. Just building slightly on the last point there. When you talk about applying science to certain things being unhelpful, you seem to be implying that you're unable to question certain things scientifically. And I find that quite restrictive, that in a way you are suggesting that I'm not allowed or I should not use scientific methods to question how love works. I think that really is a restriction of free thought.
I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm just suggesting that it might not be as illuminating as you might hope it to be. That's the only thing that I'm suggesting. I mean, there are certain aspects about how love works that clearly science can investigate helpfully, including aspects about how we choose our partners, what it is that makes certain partners attractive to us rather than others, something about the biochemistry of love and the chemistry of attraction. These are obvious things that science can analyze. I was actually focusing very specifically on whether or not I can ask for that sort of scientific knowledge of the particular relationship that I am in with an individual other. And that I was suggesting that if I subject that relationship to the sort of methodological skepticism and rigor of science, that it's likely to be destructive to the very conditions which are necessary for a relationship to grow and be healthy. That's all I was suggesting.
I guess you never know until you try, though.
Finally, one last comment. Sorry, I, in fairness, should give Justin the opportunity to comment before going for one brief last comment.
So I think we might agree that there's a difference between science's ability to get to an understanding of everything and science as a good way to live one's life. So we can use science to understand a lot of insights about love. And when I talked about evolutionary ethics and evolutionary psychology, we can use those insights as well. And again, they might not always be applicable when we're actually trying to implement ethics, just like implementing love. It's not applicable to use science, right? But understanding the roots of love. I think that understanding versus implementation is a good dichotomy to keep track of.
I'm going to keep this simple, I hope. I sent an assumption in the very question that religion and God knows and defines what is moral and ethical and good. And I find that an assumption.
I can only say that I haven't assumed that, and I think I've made it fairly clear all evening that I haven't assumed that. I don't think Justin has either, but no.
I think we finally have agreement on something.
Well, I'm tempted to ask another question now, but I will exempt myself from the. I will get an opportunity to thank the panelists, obviously, but I'd like to thank all of you for coming out, whether you participated or not, but for being here, being open-minded, and helping me moderate this debate and forcing the panelists to shape this question in the way that you want to hear it. So a round of applause for all of you. And before we release you to go forth and be good with or without God, I'll turn it back over to CCEPA to close the event.
Good evening, folks. I'm Catherine Mead, and I'm on the board of CCEPA. And I'm here to thank all who have participated this evening. First, I'd like to thank our moderator, Kevin Kindred. Thank you so much. Yes. Thank you so much for providing thought-provoking opening comments, for setting a respectful tone for both the panelists as well as for us as an audience, and just for doing such an excellent job moderating. So thank you very much. And thanks. And to Eric, thank you for sharing your vast knowledge and insight with us. It was really helpful. I must say, though, if ethics are the product of anxiety and uncertainty, as you posit, I just can't wait to see what kind of ethics are going to come out of this economic crisis. Myself, just looking at my dwindling RRSPs, I'm feeling more ethical right there. So good. Yeah. So I'll get on my knees. And to you, Justin, first, thank you for flying all the way in from Toronto to be with us tonight. And it was very interesting to hear you advocate for an open society. I found it not quite as interesting to learn that my thinking is quite similar to a chimpanzee's. So that was a little disconcerting, but thank you so much. And I actually have gifts for each of you that we have taken great pains to factor in your individual interests. That's yours. Yeah. And for you, Kevin, thanks very much. I'd also just like to take this moment to once again remind each of you to please just take a moment to complete the evaluation forms that you find in front of you. That is the way that we know how we're doing. So please take a moment to do that. Also, I just want to remind you to join us right here on March 11th for part 2 in the Trust in Education series. Finally, as Kevin already did, I really, truly want to thank each of you for taking time out of your night to choose to join us. So thank you very much for doing that. Good night.